The second period of the latter prophets is in the period after the destruction of the northern kingdom. And of course, the northern kingdom is destroyed in 722 BCE, up to the time of the final destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in what you could call the second conquest of Babylon in 586 BCE. And so it's really the period between that we're talking about now for the second group of prophets. And this second group of prophets consists out of the major prophets that we know, which is the second half of Isaiah, often called Deutero meaning second Isaiah, and then the other major writings of Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Also with some of the minor prophets, and we'll talk about them just now. So what we have in this period of history is we have the decline now of Judah. That where the northern kingdom has been destroyed by the Assyrians, we now have Judah continuing as now the only remnant of the people of Israel, of the tribes of Jacob. And what we have in this period is that slow decline where progressively as the kings take over Judah, they are now no longer kings who are only following Yahweh. And essentially they go down the same path as the path that the northern kingdom did, where they begin to be affected by the gods around them, and they begin to import or increase those gods into their own particular worship as well. And what we see is that every now and then there's a bright spark that comes in. So people like Josiah, who starts a new way of doing things, or wants to reconnect with who God is. But then it falls back again into a king who doesn't just worship Yahweh, and they fall away again, and the people fall away. And so we have this cycle, but the cycle is trending down. And it's trending down to the point of judgment. And it's in the midst of that you've got Deutero Isaiah and Jeremiah particularly speaking into that context, saying, you need to turn or burn. You need to come back to God. God wants to restore you. God wants to bring you back. God wants to do it, but it looks as if there's an inevitability now because you're not prepared to change, that what's going to happen is that God is going to punish you like He punished Israel. You are worshipping other gods, and so these other gods are moving you away from the worship of Yahweh. And not just the worship of Yahweh, but actually then living out that worship in the way in which we live our lives. Jeremiah particularly has a very long prophetic life because he's called at a very early age. We're not sure what that age is. We just know from Jeremiah chapter 1 in his call that he sees himself to be young. And in fact, not just himself, but the community sees him as young. Which means that he's most probably younger than what a priest had to be, which was 30 years old. So he's a young man who gets this call to be a prophet. And in fact, he's cranky the whole time about it. It's a wonderfully cranky book about saying that he wishes that he had something good to tell the people instead of this bad stuff that he constantly has to say in terms of God. The book of Isaiah has a very similar theme, or at least Deutero Isaiah has a very similar theme of saying that we've not done the right thing. And so there's a certain inevitability about the fact that God's going to destroy Israel, and in order to come back with a new remnant, a new group who would actually live out Torah, will live out the things of God. In Ezekiel, what we have is a very different book, a very different prophecy. And the reason why is because it's not actually written in Israel or in Judah. It's actually written in captivity in Babylon. Because as I said, there was a first conquest, and that was in 596. In 596. And it's in 596 that Nebuchadnezzar takes a group of the leaders back to Babylon, the first exile, if you want to call it that. And one of those people who was taken in that first exile was Ezekiel. And Ezekiel then writes his prophecy from Babylon with a similar theme saying this is what's going to happen to you too if you don't listen. If you don't obey God, then this is going to be the inevitable outcome of where we're at. So again, yes, there is a future component. Yes, there is a future framework for them. But the future is not a set framework. It's rather saying that's your future if you don't change in the present. The fact that that future happens is not because it's set, but rather because they don't listen and so change. They don't build that house according to that foundation of Torah. Other than the three major books, and they're called major only because they each contained in their own scroll, there is also the minor prophets. And most of the minor prophets come from this period as well. And we need to see that those minor prophets are not minor because they are not relevant or not useful. They're called minor prophets only because all 12 fit on one scroll, and so therefore were always taken together. But in terms of their usefulness and so on, they're still there. The prophets that are within this period are Obadiah. Now, Obadiah generally deals with Edom, with the Edomites. There's Nahum, who deals with the Assyrians. There's also the one which is hard to spell, which is Habakkuk, which really deals with a much more vexing question, and that is, why do the evil prosper and sometimes the good don't? That's a very big question, and one which will be reconnected again in another module, in the next module, which is module 9, which deals with what's called the writings. And the particular book that deals with that is the book called Job. So Habakkuk and then Zephaniah. And Zephaniah deals with this thing called the day of the Lord, or the day of judgment, and essentially has been involved in that and is interested in that concept of judgment, and realizing that there is an end point to all things, that even those who've done this to Israel will also be judged, and there will be a judgment at the end of all things. And so all of these writings are happening during that period of decline in Judah, right through to the end of Judah. And in fact, people like Jeremiah would have been there potentially at the end, and instead of being taken into exile, fled to Egypt. At least that's what some people believe. And then Ezekiel, who actually was taken into exile, and so writes from exile, from his perspective of that. But in each of them, there is hope. That even in the midst of the destruction, even in the midst of God speaking against the people, there is a hope of restoration. There is a hope of renewal. There is the hope that God will still bring them back. It's that hope that we live by when we live by faith.